I will not bury the lead, which is that we don't have a whole lot of tax law changes, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to enter into the peaceful slumber of divided government. Hallelujah. That said, we're going to lean a little bit more into politics in the next few minutes. We're going to touch on what can or may happen for tax law coming up. We're going to visit our friends at the Internal Revenue Service and then on to the 2024 presidential campaign. That said, let's go. Economy. What were the issues in the midterm elections? The economy, as President Clinton famously said, it's the economy, stupid, and the Republicans absolutely thought they had a winning hand with inflation. After all, the White House actually kept track of gas prices on a daily basis. And if you would have noticed, they in fact used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an unprecedented way, drawing down significantly from the reserve in an effort to rein in inflation. And I recently heard, according to Chevron CEO Mike Wirth, that he felt that action did have some impact on pricing. And the fact that they're buying back into the reserve right now and at $80 a barrel, and we're liquidating at $100 a barrel. I guess I'm pleased to note that the Biden administration understands the notion of buying low and selling high. So that's good. But anyway, we thought the Republicans had an issue, a winning issue with the economy. Feel free to laugh, guys, if anything, it sounds funny here. Abortion was another issue that was prominent in the midterm elections. Post the Roe overturn, Kansas famously put proposed an amendment to their constitution called Value Them Both, which was to remove constitutional protection for abortion in all instances. That proposed amendment was voted down in flames, and I believe it helped make the Democrats realize that on abortion, perhaps there was a winning political issue for them. Immigration, all you have to do is watch the news and see people getting bused from the southern border to Martha's Vineyard or New York to realize that that was an issue. Voting rights, the endless cacophony of Save Our Democracy, January 6th commissions, endless voting challenges, and a significant growth area for attorney fees made voting rights absolutely an issue in this election. Lastly, we had crime and guns. Obviously, violent crime rates are up. We were experimenting over the years with defunding the police, and I'm personally glad that my daughter is out of Jersey City and back to the safe haven of the suburbs of Pittsburgh. So those were the issues, but those were not the only issues. This next slide shows presidential job approval ratings, and the far one on the right with the arrow is President Biden going into the midterms. I think that this slide or this graph would be charitably described as who are the tallest midgets with respect to these low ratings, and President Biden was the tallest of the three midgets, the other two being Truman in the 40s and G.W. Bush in 06. So if that's your slide going into the midterms, what do you think happens to the party in power with an unpopular president? You get the inverse of that slide, which is this one. Simply put, unpopular presidents tended to have their parties get hammered in the midterms. In skiing, we have this expression that if you fall so hard that you lose your skis, you lose your poles, your gloves come out, and you get your helmet full of snow. They call that a yard sale. And Republicans were absolutely expecting a yard sale from the Democrats in this midterms. They were talking about wins of maybe 40 to 50 seats and control of the Senate. So before we get into the final results and why it happened and how it happened, I thought we'd just spend a moment on the battleground. Like what did the political map look like? And, you know, in the Senate out of the gate, the Dems were in charge 50-50, and Vice President Harris had the tie-breaking vote because the two independents caucused with the Democrats and tended to vote that way. The Democrats had to defend more toss-up or super close races, but the Republicans had to defend more moderately close races. In the House, obviously the Democrats control currently, but the map favored Republicans, which if all they could do is avoid laying an egg, they probably would have gotten to a 2-seat majority. So that, generally speaking, was what the battleground map looked like. Back to the Senate, because it always fascinates me. It's not that the Democrats didn't have their opportunities. There were 3 GOP retirees, including our own Senator Toomey in Pennsylvania. And the Republicans, they had their advantages too, which was they were existing really close in the Senate, only 1 seat out, and they started out of the gate with a whole lot of cash to spend. So the race tightened, at least according to Politico, at the end. But the expectation, at least according to Politico, was that the Republicans would still win the Senate by a seat and would end up 15 plus in the House. And so while it's not exactly a red wave, it's more like a little splash in the kiddie pool. It was still a Republican expected win. On to the final results. We will find out later today what happens in Georgia, but I'm expecting the final answer to be 51-49 in the Senate. And in the House, it's plus for the Republicans 7 or 9, depending upon some recounts out west. So obviously, a net 6-seat win is a long way from a 40 or 50-seat red wave. A little bit on Georgia as we go into this. This is when I wrote this slide up, it was really close. I looked at Politico today and some articles, and it looks like Warnock is going to win. There's some things that are in the Democrats' favor. Early voting seems to have been very big down in Georgia, so that typically helps Democrats. Would have required significant Republican turnout at the end. It's raining down there, so that doesn't help. And Herschel Walker basically wasn't finishing strong. He looked like me in my final run around the track in a 440 sprint. I just don't have a lot of gas in the tank, and maybe Herschel took too many hits in the football game and didn't have a strong kick at the end. So we'll see if that prediction comes true. I'm expecting a Warnock victory. That leads me to my next slide, which is how in the world did the Republicans snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? The Republican leadership, as we'll see on the next slide, was absolutely not happy with President Trump, as we will see. And the question for the future of Republicans is how will President Trump fill in the little white blank at the bottom of this meme in the corner? Republicans would like the adjective to be the word help. I'm really going to help the Republicans in 2024. Democrats likely have more other colorful adjectives to use here. Okay. All right. So how did the Republicans snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? And I'm going to pull up what Mitch McConnell said. We'll pull up what Pat Toomey said. We'll pull up what Judd Gregg said. Basically the Republican leadership. You can read that, but as you're reading, I'll just point out one thing, which is the Arizona gubernatorial race where Carrie Lake was running for the Republican ticket with a strong Trump endorsement, and she lost by 17,000 votes. Yet, if you look at the downstream ticket of Republicans who won, even in Maricopa County, which is mostly Phoenix and is infamous for being a flashpoint for voting issues, the local prosecutor, Rachel Mitchell, got 23,000 more votes than the top of the ticket candidate Lake. House Republican candidates in that county got 40,000 more votes than Carrie Lake. The state treasurer, Kimberly Yee, got 77,000 more votes in Phoenix than Carrie Lake. So obviously what happened here is Republican voters split their ticket to not vote for Carrie Lake, perhaps because Carrie Lake was touting 2020 election fraud and was a Trump candidate and a Trump supporter. That is what got the attention of the Republican leadership, I think, is the source of some of those quotes. And if you look at Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania and look at Judd Gregg from New Hampshire, and if this issue of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory sounds familiar, it should if you're from the state of New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, whose candidates went down in flames to Democratic opposition. All right. So what does the future of tax legislation look like? I love this meme. It's the story of my career, where I get to explain to my clients what taxes are really like. That said, I can summarize future tax legislation with this comment. Oh, the blissful peace of divided government. So what's left for our friends in the 117th Congress as it relates to taxation? So while the Democrats still have power, but it's only 50-50 power, and they still have to deal with Arizona Senator Semina and West Virginia Senator Manchin. There's some things that they potentially can push over a finish line because they control all branches of government. There seems to be actually bipartisan agreement to going back to expensing research and development costs. So beginning next year, absent legislation, we'll have to be capitalizing those things and amortizing them over a 5 or 10-year period, which the taxpayer can elect. There's also seems to be some interest in loosening up the restrictions on interest expense deductions under Section 163J. And I would expect the Democrats will push for making permanent the current levels of the child tax credit, which was enacted in the American Rescue Plan. So what's on the agenda for the 118th Congress coming up? Well, welcome to divided government, ladies and gentlemen, where the Republicans that are in control could be expected to block tax increases, and our legislative opportunities are sizably less at hand. The House and Senate Republican leadership will be calling for making permanent the sunsetting provisions of this TCJA. We've gone over those. You expect the Biden administration to take the bully club and instead of trying to legislate tax law, they'll just regulate it and issue executive orders around it. Biden administration will undoubtedly propose previously failed provisions regarding corporate income tax increases, individual income tax increases. I basically view that as preening for the camera because I don't think they stand much of a chance. And then obviously we're in for the joy of watching the torturous debt ceiling fights and who knows what will happen in the budget. Which brings me to a lead into my next slide, because the Republicans are making noise about trying to scale back my poor friends at the IRS. So what's happening with our friend here, Chris Pratt from Parks and Rec, the furtive IRS agent who has no idea how tax work and is at this point is afraid to ask. I found Bianco's slide about the increase in the number of pages in the tax code compelling. And for the first time, as I'm sitting there listening to him drone on about that, it dawned on me that the rate of increase in the tax code is significantly in excess of the birth rate in the United States. So at some distant mathematical point in the future, when I am retired, we may have as many pages in the Internal Revenue Code as there are people in the United States. In theory, it's possible. Unlikely, but I mean, it's possible. So what's happening with our poor IRS agents? They get to enforce all this with an aging, underpaid, underappreciated, over-unionized workforce with technological systems that go back to COBOL. And if you don't know what COBOL is, which I'm presuming that some of you on this call may not know what COBOL is, it's a course I took in 1982, and the language was already old back then as a computer language. I think the only reason that the system hasn't been hacked yet is that none of the hackers know that it exists. Anyway, let's take a look at the IRS workforce, right? This is the IRS full-time equivalent workforce from 1989 to 2018. They've actually had a decreasing labor force as they're dealing with ever increasing pages in the Internal Revenue Code, regulation, complexity. Stated differently, the IRS workforce per million US residents. So back in, what is that, 1991, there was 450 IRS employees per million US residents. Now there's 237 of them. simply put, this is not a recipe for much service from the Internal Revenue Service. And in fact, in the latest acts in Congress, the IRS is projected and being funded to hire 87,000 new employees. And if you think about this, this is about 1/4 of the size of the entire firm of Deloitte. And that, if that sounds daunting, also consider this, that the IRS leadership has never done anything like this because their labor force has in fact been shrinking over time. So what they're endeavoring to do is really this, like, it's like a backflip off the low dive. This is not an easy thing for anybody to do, let alone in an entrenched agency with aging systems like the IRS. Expect turbulence to come. The challenges they have are finding talent, training and retaining talent. I found this one interesting. The commissioner of the IRS testified in Congress that the IRS is expected to lose 50% of its workforce to retirement over the next 5 years. Now, I think that might be a little bit of preening in Congress to get more money, but even still, even if he's even close to that, that's a big number. Challenge tax codes, complex mess. We're using the Internal Revenue Service as a vehicle of social engineering or wealth distribution, i.e. refundable credits. Everybody got the COVID credits, PPPs, ERCs, child tax credits. I mean, it's endless, right? We are using the Internal Revenue Service for things they were not particularly designed to do out of the gate. Oh, and finally, they have to begin auditing the right taxpayers. If that all this sounds daunting and challenging, yeah, it is. We are going to have a whole lot of chop for years to come with the Internal Revenue Service. All right, on to the presidential race. Here we go again. Probably the individuals most rooting for the rematch you see on the screen are those from the late night comedy show hosts, because this second go round would absolutely be a target-rich environment for them. So let's first look at the Republican contenders. And number one on the list, this is according to the Washington Post, from which I quote directly. Ron DeSantis is the most likely Republican contender. Obviously, he killed it in Florida, and he killed it so big that President Trump actually gave him a nickname of Ron DeSanctimonious. So you know you're doing well when you're getting nicknamed from President Trump. And for those of you struggling to find where this is in Webster, sanctimonious means hypocritically pious or devout. That said, what I find interesting about DeSantis's killer win in Florida was what he did in Miami-Dade. He won it, which is like a Republican carrying San Francisco or Allegheny County. Unheard of. He did well, which makes him the leader in the clubhouse. Number two is Donald Trump, and what more can be said other than the 9 lives of Donald Trump? Since defeating Hillary Clinton, he's the first president since Hoover to land this belly flop. In one term, he lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and now, for a repeat performance, has snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in this year's midterm elections. Yet, his base is strong, and the guy's got 9 lives, and we could be seeing him again. He, according to the Washington Post, is the number 2 candidate in the clubhouse. Number 3 is Mike Pence, who is furiously trying to dance between the raindrops of being Trumpian without having the bluster. That's Mike Pence. And lastly is Governor Glenn Youngkin, who famously turned the blue state of Virginia red in his gubernatorial race. And he did it by running away from President Trump to some degree, which was the DeSantis strategy in Florida. Moving on to the contenders. From the Democratic side, we have President Biden, whose midterm performance likely increases his chance of running in the 2024 year. In case you're counting, if he wins, he will be 86 at the end of his second term. And he apparently is, according to the Washington Post, most likely candidate. Second most likely, according to the Washington Post, is Pete Buttigieg. Wow, he's ahead of Vice President Harris, the former U.S. Naval Reserve officer, the mayor of South Bend, Democratic committee chairman, presidential campaign failure, and now Secretary of Transportation. That's his resume. Is the number 2 contender. I can tell you this, at least my impression of the guy, is that he is a very smooth talker. He makes it look good on Face the Nation and Meet the Press. Number 3, obviously, is Kamala Harris. Politico says there is a Democratic lawmaker dilemma, and I'm going to quote it. The dread for a Democratic lawmaker is from the specter of nominating an octogenarian, President Biden, with a dismal approval rating to the equally delicate dilemma of whether to nominate his more unpopular vice president or pass over the first Black woman in the job. That, it strikes me, is the definition of a very difficult political dilemma, but that is where the Democrats are. Last one, according to the Washington Post, is Jared Polis. He's the governor of California, which is a swing state, which he recently won in a big fashion. One of his claims to fame was bucking COVID restrictions in his state, say ahead of the attitudes in the progressives or in the Democratic Party. He's well liked out there, and he's a governor of a swing state, which plays well in the polls. So perhaps we'll see Jared Polis coming from the Democratic Party.